Welcome to episode 141 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean texts, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. At this point in our podcast, we've now examined both Lucretius and the major letters of Epicurus, and we'll now turn our attention to one of the other leading advocates of Epicurus in the ancient world, Diogenes of Oinoanda. We won't make any effort to go through all the fragments of his inscription that survive, but we will look at what Diogenes chose to highlight as the key aspects of the philosophy that both he and the ancient Epicureans as a whole thought it most important for the world to know. We'll use both the translation by Martin Ferguson Smith as well as the translation by C.W. Chilton as our text, and we highly recommend that you start your review of the inscription at the site devoted to it from Catalonia, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Now let's join Martin reading today's text.
Diogenes the Oinoandian and friend of Athens, epitome on nature. And I wanted to refute those who accuse natural science of being unable to be of any benefit to us. In this way, even though I am not engaging in public affairs, I say these things through the inscription just as if I were taking action. And in an endeavor to prove that what benefits our nature, namely freedom from disturbance, is identical to one and all. And so, having described the second reason for the inscription, I now go on to mention my mission and to explain its character and nature. Having already reached the sunset of my life, being almost on the verge of departure from the world on account of old age, I wanted, before being overtaken by death, to compose a fine anthem to celebrate the fullness of pleasure, and so to help now those who are well constituted. Now, if only one person or two or three or four or five or six or any larger number you choose, sir, provided that it is not very large, were in a bad predicament, I would address them individually and do all in my power to give them the best advice. But as I have said before, the majority of people suffer from a common disease, as in a plague, with their false notions about things, and their number is increasing. For a mutual emulation, they catch the disease from one another, like sheep. Moreover, it is right to help also generations to come, for they too belong to us, though they are still unborn. And besides, love of humanity prompts us to aid also the foreigners who come here. Now, since the remedies of the inscription reach a larger number of people, I wish to use this store to advertise publicly the medicines that bring salvation. These medicines we have put fully to the test, for we have dispelled the fears that grip us without justification, and as for pains, those that are groundless we have completely excised, while those that are natural we have reduced to an absolute minimum, making their magnitude minute. Observing that most people suffer from false notions about things, and do not listen to the body when it brings important and just accusations against the soul, alleging that it is unwarrantably mauled and maltreated by the soul and dragged to things which are not necessary. In fact, the wants of the body are small and easy to obtain, and the soul too can live well by sharing in their enjoyment, while those of the soul are both great and difficult to obtain, and besides being of no benefit to our nature, actually involve dangers. So, to reiterate what I was saying, observing that these people are in this predicament, I bewailed their behavior and wept over the wasting of their lives, and I considered it the responsibility of a good man to give benevolent assistance to the utmost of one's ability, to those of them who are well constituted. This is the first reason for the inscription. I declare that the vain fear of death and that of the gods grip many of us, and that joy of real value is generated not by theaters and baths and perfumes and ointments, which we have led to the masses, but by natural science. Wow, these were elegant formulations. And whether this is a translator or the original like that is impressive.
Yes, indeed. It's impressive. Thank you for reading that, Martin. We're off to a new topic this week in discussing the inscription of Diogenes of Oinoanda. And we've got a lot to talk about before we go too much into the detail of the text.
Right. And I wanted to go particularly into a bit of the historical context of this Eastern, I don't want to say branch, but this epicenter of Epicureanism that developed in this area of what the Greeks would call Ionia, or Asia Minor, and what we would think of as being modern day Turkey primarily. And it almost starts with Epicurus himself, because he was born on the island of Samos. And that was a Greek island, but it was actually right off the coast of what we would now call Turkey. In Ionia, this cluster of islands along the Turkish coast, and indeed along the coast itself. And it would help to think of Greek culture in this era as being clustered along the shores of the Mediterranean, more so than actually the mainland of Greece and the largely unpopulated mountainous areas in northern Greece. It's very much the coastline of the Mediterranean that is central to this culture and this civilization. So as I say, it starts with Samos, which is right off the Turkish coast. Epicurus is coming into a time when Athens has just reached its height as the center of philosophy. But before Athens, Miletus was the center of philosophical inquiry. And it's almost more Miletus than Athens that Epicurus draws so much of his interest in what we're talking about here, which is natural science, the inquiry into nature. And it begins with the philosopher Thales, who was born on, or at least lived in Miletus, followed by Anaximander, Anaximenes. These very first primitive efforts to understand the world, not exclusively in religious, theological terms, the nature was created by a god, but to understand nature in her own terms. And even though some of their theories, like the idea that the foundational element of everything is water, this sounds highly outmoded to us now and very primitive, but in fact, as an effort to understand nature as something that is made up of matter, that operates according to its own principles, this really starts here in Asia Minor. And so it's no coincidence that it's here in Asia Minor that Epicurus derives his philosophy. And again, it's no coincidence that it's Asia Minor, really, that Epicurus's philosophy has its very early flourishing. And I took a quote from an article that was published by Norman DeWitt called Notes on the History of Epicureanism. And he writes that Epicureanism found the field most favorable for expansion in the East, especially in Asia Minor and Palestine. It was late arriving in Italy, but spread rapidly in the last century of the Republic. So it's in Asia Minor that is the crucible of Epicurean philosophy in many ways. And we see that with Epicurus and his early career in Lampsacus. Lampsacus is on the coast of Asia Minor, like ancient Oinoanda would apparently have been, and it's located in an area known as the Hellespont, which is this waterway connection between the Aegean Sea, which is part of the Mediterranean, and the Pontus, or Black Sea. Okay, so further on in history, we're now coming into the 2nd century, is when this inscription apparently was laid forth. And it was also in the 2nd century that you have this other Epicurean, Lucian, of Samosata. Samosata is in far eastern Turkey, or in at least central eastern Turkey. So everything is swirling around in Asia Minor at this time, and in Lampsacus on the northwest shore of Asia Minor, in Oinoanda, which is sort of in the southwest shore of Asia Minor, and in Abanuticus, or Abanutekus, which is the city that Lucian was living in at the time of Alexander the Oracle Monger, and that great essay was on the north shore of Asia Minor. So it's very large Epicurean communities living in areas like this, in the town of Ephesus, which was a great seat of power in that area around the same time. This is after the fall, of course, of Alexander the Great's empire. And when he died, his empire was split up into 3 large groups. You had the Macedonian group, the Egyptian part of the empire, which was led by Ptolemy, and the Asian part of the empire, which was controlled by what was called the Seleucid dynasty. So it's under the Seleucid dynasty that Diogenes is now living and inscribing this wonderful testament to Epicurean philosophy in something like 260 square meters of rock on the face of a portico. So that is a hint of the historical context. Cassius?
Yes, Joshua, let me make sure that I'm understanding the big points you just hit. So geographically, we're talking about what was called then Asia Minor. We call it Turkey today. And the section of Turkey we're talking about is in the western part of Turkey. And it sounds like the southern side of it, not too far from the Mediterranean. Is that correct?
That's precisely where Oinoanda is located and where Ephesus was located, very close to the island of Rhodes, and Samos are both in that area. And it's not just the southwest part of it, though. It's the whole coast of Asia Minor that touches on the Mediterranean.
Okay, so geographically, that's where we are. As far as the time period, apparently we're in the era of Hadrian in the early 100 ADs. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And so this Hadrianic period would be during the early spread of Christianity, but obviously the Roman Empire had not become Christian at that point. It was relatively early in the spread of Christianity, and the Romans were in charge of it, right? By that time.
The Seleucid Empire will have been eclipsed by the Romans in about 63 BC, so we're well into the Roman period now.
But it's an area that would still be dominated by Greek culture and Greek language. The inscription itself is, of course, written in Greek. It's not written in Latin. So it's still a heavily Greek culture. Okay, so that's the geography and that's the time period. And as far as the references that we're going to be talking about and using to discuss the inscription, the primary website, the very best place to go, is a website put up by a man named Harold Roig Igorina, who is from Catalonia. And when you Google Oinoanda, you're going to find a lot about him, and he's got some videos out there. But his website is oinoanda.cat, and that's one of the things you'll run into when you start studying this, is that it's spelled different ways, it seems like. His website is ENOANDA.CAT, the cat for Catalonia, and then the spelling of the location, Oinoanda. His website has a lot of good pictures and background of the inscription, and you will see that he features the best translation that's available of the surviving fragments, which has been done by a man named Martin Ferguson Smith, who is the premier living authority on the inscription. He's done probably more work on it than anybody else, and his translation is the most thorough. He's supplemented it over the years as new fragments have been discovered. There's also other reference material available. There's a book, if the author's name is C.W. Chilton, but his book is older and doesn't contain the most recent fragments that the website in Catalonia has included. That really is the place to go when you're studying this material. And we ought to comment also, when you go to that website, you'll see that one of the challenges in studying the inscription is, of course, that it doesn't survive complete. The wall on which it was inscribed was destroyed centuries ago and scattered throughout the area. And so what has had to happen over the last couple of hundred years is that archaeologists going through the area have been digging and attempting to reassemble the fragments that are there and available. And of course, many of them are in very poor condition. So one thing you'll see as we discuss the inscription is that there are many bracketed phrases. And those brackets indicate that Mr. Smith has done his best to reconstruct the material that's within those brackets, but that those reconstructions are subject to error. That's what he has come up with as the best, most likely reconstruction. But anybody who's reading the inscription is going to have to be very careful to consider that the bracketed parts, which are very important in many of the fragments, are not necessarily unchallengeable. Even though Mr. Smith is a great authority on all this, he's had to fill in the blanks, so to speak, on words that are no longer available on the fragment. If you were looking for somebody to fill in the blanks on an inscription like this, Martin Ferguson Smith would probably be the man to do it. He is also the author of probably the current best text on Lucretius, an edition published by the Hackett Publishing Company that is probably the most authoritative version of Lucretius. So Martin Ferguson Smith has devoted much of his career, it seems like, to study of the ancient texts and Epicurus in particular. And in going through Lucretius, he's familiarized himself with Epicurean philosophy. So I think it's good reason to believe that his reconstructions are about the best estimate that anybody could come up with at this point in time. And the way the wall looked is a subject of debate. It was apparently a wall and set up with the intention of being like a public monument or a public inscription. I don't know whether this is a marketplace area or what other type area, but people who would pass by would see this very long and very detailed philosophical inscription.
One thing we do think we know about this inscription, or the scholars who are working on it think they know, is that it contained at least 3 treatises written by Diogenes himself, as well as various letters of Epicurus, maxims, which Epicurus will have written. So there's the treatise on ethics, a treatise on physics, a treatise on old age, letters that were written from Diogenes to his friends. These are not just personal friends, but Epicurean communities that would have been clustered in the major cities around Asia Minor. And some letters of Epicurus himself, including a letter from Epicurus to his mother on the subject of dreams. It's in a very fragmentary condition. Obviously, we say fragments. It's not just that the text is fragmentary, but the rock that made up the wall has been scattered, Cassius, as you said, and it's been found in places like some of these large sections of rock were used in foundations of homes. So it's been partially destroyed by time, partially been peeled off maybe and put into new buildings. Some of it's been buried. So it's not in a great condition, but it's in sufficiently good condition to know a little bit of what was written there and what it comes from. Maybe to help answer some of your other questions, it's referred to as a piazza, is the area that he had this inscription placed. And a piazza, maybe not very familiar to some audiences, but people who've been to Italy will know it's a town square. It's an open public space. Rome is full of them. And it's a place where trade would have been conducted. You can think of it as almost a small agora or forum, and clustered around with buildings and shops and that kind of thing. So it's thought that because, of course, this would have taken a lot of money and a lot of labor. And so it is suspected that Diogenes of Oinoanda must have been some kind of wealthy merchant, perhaps, to have had the necessary wealth to not only have bought the land, but then to have paid the scribes the money that it would have taken to fill out this section, which is about 80 meters long and about, what did it say, 2.37 meters high. So this is quite a lot of area that's being covered. So this is 262 and a half feet long and about nearly 8 feet tall. So if you can imagine that, an 8-foot high wall running to 262 feet or whatever I just said, and covered completely with inscriptions written in Greek of the philosophy of Epicurus, for the benefit, as he says in this text, of passers-by, and not just citizens, but anyone who happens to be walking by who can gain something beneficial from this.
Okay, that's a good entry point. We originally began this podcast going through Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, which was a poem that he had written and dedicated to a particular person, Memmius, but pretty clearly was intended to be read by people beyond just the one person. It wasn't just a private letter. It was a tremendous amount of effort that Titus Lucretius Carus had put into enshrining Epicurean philosophy into poem form in 50 BC. And so here, maybe almost 150 years later, we have someone in Asia Minor who is Greek, who apparently near the end of his life is investing a lot of effort and presumably money to do something fairly similar to what Lucretius had done, a public presentation of Epicurean philosophy to the world to some extent, not just to one particular person, but to the average citizen of this area, Oinoanda. One of the comments I see as we go back to the text is it says, in this way, even though I'm not engaging in public affairs, I say these things through the inscription just as if I were taking action. So it's worth thinking about one of the common themes we deal with in Epicurus. What is the purpose of life? What is the purpose of philosophy? Why is Epicurus spending his time on all this natural science? And once he has himself reached these conclusions about the right way to live, why does he bother to tell anybody else? If, in fact, the happy life involves to some extent withdrawal from politics, if it involves to some extent staying aloof from crowds of people who are confused and who are running around in anxiety and desperation to some degree, why do you then inject yourself back into society by proclaiming this information to other people? Why do we have a EpicureanFriends.com website? Why are we doing this podcast? Why don't we just take this information that we've learned from Epicurus and go sit in our cave, so to speak, and simply profit from it ourselves? What is the reason why anybody would spend their time talking about Epicurean philosophy to their friends, much less to strangers. Why would an Epicurean want to proclaim Epicurus to the general population? Why would he want to spend all this effort spreading the ideas?
Well, I think part of the answer to that has to include this idea in Epicureanism, and we get a bit of it here, that the prevailing attitude toward life, the religions of the ancient world, we could almost say the religions of the modern world, include people in something like a great moral disease. That was the phrase that John Stuart Mill used in describing his father's attitude toward religion. He said that it was a Lucretian attitude fundamentally, and that people need to be rescued from bad ideas, not rescued at the point of a sword, as other philosophies and religions have attempted to do. They need to be convinced that there's more to life than just looking for some solace from the horrible world that has been inflicted upon them by the gods. There's more to life than simply hoping for a life beyond the grave. And the idea, hopefully, is that we can convince people that life is worth living and worth enjoying, and that it's worthwhile for its own sake. I don't know if I'm doing a very good job of explaining
Well,
that.
part of what I want to address there is, of course, in Christianity, there's the Great Commission. And in many of these other religions, there's this idea that God wants you to go out and spread the word to other people. You're following some kind of a commandment to do that. Or depending on the religion and the society, you're part of some kind of a conquest of other countries where you're spreading your ideas as a means of cultural conquest. But what can we learn here about why an Epicurean would be interested in talking to other people about these things? Again, is it just a general humanist idea that we should just benefit everybody and that we have some obligation to do that? Or what can we tell about his motivations in what he's saying here to spread the word beyond just his immediate friends?
Well, we could look at what he tells us himself. He says, I wanted, before being overtaken by death, to compose a fine anthem to celebrate the fullness of pleasure, and so to help now those who are well constituted. He wants to help people. As to the question of why he wants to help people, that might not be as clear, but it's clear that he sees around him that the way people look at their lives, the way people are motivated by the opinions that they hold, does not yield good results. That seems to be the basic problem that he's looking at. And he thinks that maybe if we just can change the way they think about the world, if we can change their opinions on some of these things, they can live better lives. And for us, what that gives us is a world more congenial to the things that we want to do and to the kind of inquiry that we want to conduct.
Right. And the part that you, I think, read just a minute ago largely answers the question to some degree, where it says that he, observing these people are in this predicament, I bewailed their behavior and wept over the wasting of their lives, and I considered it to be the responsibility of a good man to give benevolent assistance to the utmost of one's ability to those of them who are well constituted. And he says that's really the reason for the inscription. So he's not doing it because he's going to get a reward in heaven for putting up this inscription. He's not doing it because he just feels like necessarily that there's an ideal man who is going to do these things. It seems to me he has the same sort of belief in the correctness of the doctrine that Lucretius does. And he is motivated to some extent by when he says bewailed their behavior and wept over the wasting of their lives. He's feeling to some extent a pain observing how people are in distress and receiving pleasure from the idea of helping them.
Cassius, the way you just said that, it almost made me think of Cicero and what he had to say about the Epicureans. And I almost think that Cicero could say the same thing. He sees people caught in the web of Epicureanism and wants to help them out. You could very easily say the same thing about Christianity and the way that it looks at people who are non-Christians. And they're motivated by a desire to save them. And so part of this narrative has to include, I think, a recognition of the inherent conflict that exists at all times and in all places between these different competing philosophies and worldviews and religious outlooks. And you have to almost stake your claim, as it were, or you're going to find yourself swept up into I almost want to say a political environment that is going to be very hostile to you if you don't.
Right. And that's a good place to go there. There's several principal doctrines that I would say are relevant to this. starting with the one that says that of all the things that a wise man is going to do to procure a happy life, one of the most important is friendship. And so you have to have friends in order to live successfully and happily in life. And as Epicurus says in the letter to Menorchius, you want to be able to study nature among like-minded people who are friendly to you. In order to do that, you've got to find them or create them to some degree by discussing the philosophy with them yourself. So you've got a very personal interest in not only the pleasure of helping these other people, but the practical aspect of it is that in order to live your life the most happily, you really need people around you who see the world in a similar way that you do. Not only the doctrine about friendship, but there are several others, including I think 39 and 40, that talk about the best way of life is going to be among people who are friendly to you and again, who have the same type of worldview that you do yourself. That security comes through that. And it's a very practical way of looking at things, that if you're off on your own by yourself, it's unlikely that you're going to be as happy as you could otherwise be if you have friends and a support network around you. And if you don't have that, if you think that everybody around you is being led astray in increasing numbers, then you've got to do something about that and try to identify and gather around you to the extent that you can people who are of your similar mindset. Why don't we use that to go back into the text of this first paragraph that we're reading, because he has some very sharp things to say. And one of them is that now if only one person or two or three or four or five or six were in a bad predicament, I would address them individually and do all in my power to give them the best advice, to talk to them directly. But he continues on and says, but as I've said before, the majority of people suffer from a common disease as in a plague, with their false notions about things, and their number is increasing, for in mutual emulation they catch the disease from one another like sheep. Now, we don't know for sure who he's talking about and what kind of disease is being passed around like sheep, but it would probably not be wrong to observe that this is a period in which Christianity was spreading in this area. As you said, Joshua, earlier, this is not that far from Ephesus, and the travels of Paul and his letters were written to missionary work in this area. We don't know that he's referring to Christians. He could just be referring to other people, but clearly he is not happy with the way he thinks things are going, in the sense that things are getting worse rather than better.
One thing we're doing here, though, is we're passing by the very first thing he has to say. And although it's bracketed and it may not be clear how we derive it, he says this: and I wanted to refute those who accuse natural science of being unable to be of any benefit to us. In fact, the letter to Herodotus says in direct terms that it is precisely the study of natural science and the study of nature that is the chief source of tranquility and happiness in our lives. Epicurus says this, and this is the Young translation: this method being useful even to those who are already familiarized with the laws of the universe, I recommend them while still pursuing without intermission the study of nature, which contributes more than anything else to the tranquility and happiness of life, to make a concise statement or summary of their opinions. And so this opening to what Diogenes of Oinoanda has to say is modeled very closely on the opening to the letter to Herodotus from Epicurus. It centers on the study of nature as being in some way a palliative, a corrective, a way to approach the way we think about things that will alleviate pain, free us from wrong opinions that lead to a life of confusion and disorder. And it seems to me that Diogenes of Oinoanda here is seeing the same thing that Epicurus was seeing, and thinks that the way to solve that problem is partially, at least, to write this inscription.
That's a very good point, Joshua. And as we discuss the inscription over the next several weeks, we're probably going to jump around from location to location within the fragments. And even though we haven't read it today, when you say what you've just said, Joshua, in addition to the way you've discussed that, wanting to refute those who accuse natural science of being unable to be of any benefit to us, but there definitely were philosophers and people who, they didn't just discard it. They actively took the position that studying natural science is a waste of time. And if you go down in the inscription to fragment 4 and then 5, fragment 4 specifically says that as is supposed by some of the philosophers and especially the Socratics. They say that pursuing natural science and busying oneself with the investigation of celestial phenomena is superfluous and unprofitable, and they do not even deign to concern themselves with such matters. So he's accusing the Socratics and other philosophers who are not inclined to base things on the study of nature as really opposing directly what he is suggesting is the best way to do things. To some extent, this is probably a reference to the whole idea of how the Socratics, the Platonists, don't trust the senses. They don't trust the study of nature because they think that the only way to get to the real truth is through intellectual abstractions and dealing with syllogisms and so forth. And in fact, Diogenes of Oinoanda makes that point in Fragment 5. He says, others do not explicitly stigmatize natural science as unnecessary, being ashamed to acknowledge that, but they use other means of discarding the study of nature. For when they assert that things are inapprehensible, what else are they saying than that there is no need for us to pursue the study of natural science? After all, who will choose to seek what he can never find? And then he goes on to talk about Aristotle and the Peripatetics, saying basically that the flux is so strong, everything is moving so quickly, we can't even really understand things through our senses. We'll probably come back to that either in a later episode or even later in this episode. But it's not just a throwaway line. He's warning you as well that there are those who say you're wasting your time to study it, and you need to understand why they are wrong.
Yeah, the problem from the point of view of these other philosophers is that the material world, the stuff of nature, is almost insubstantial when you compare it to the really substantial thing, which is insert X here. It could be mind. It could be the life to come hereafter for the Christians, or even early religious groups like the Egyptians who held that the life beyond the grave was somehow more important. For Epicurus, it all comes down to this fundamental ground of nature, which we perceive through the senses. But for other philosophies and worldviews, nature is a distraction from the real thing, which is whether it's Plato and his ideal forms or any of these other pursuits, nature almost falls by the wayside. And so the first thing that Diogenes of Oinoanda wants to do here is to draw your attention to nature, because nature, he believes, in the study of nature, is going to ultimately be, in some sense, the cure to what ails you. I don't want to harp on that too long, but that seems to me to be the focus of his effort here early on.
Yeah, the focus of his effort. Here's a guy nearing the end of his life. He obviously has some resources at his disposal. He's very convinced that the Epicurean viewpoint is beneficial to the world. He enjoys the study of nature. He enjoys talking about it. And so you've come to the end of your life. You know that you're not going to have an indefinite time further to just continue to talk with individuals about this. What is it that you decide is the most important thing to say to these people? Almost like a parent and a child, or any friends who are about to be parting and who aren't going to be seeing each other again. You start thinking to yourself, of all the things that I could possibly say, what are the things that are most important? And so almost like Lucretius, I think that's one of the benefits of both Lucretius and Diogenes of Oinoanda here. We know that the Epicureans had all sorts of ideas on all sorts of issues. But when you come down to brass tacks and you have to decide what is the most important thing to talk about, one of the real benefits we get from reading the Inscription and from reading Lucretius is to realize that of all of those many things they could be discussing, this is what they want people to know. This is what they consider to be the most important. And so these first fragments that we've talked about today sort of set that stage for that, about who he is, why he's writing, and it's all leading up to this presumption or this premise that what we're about to talk about are the very most important aspects of Epicurean philosophy and how it applies to life. At the end of this first fragment, he's saying that he wants to use the Stoa to advertise publicly the medicines that bring salvation, and that these medicines we have put fully to the test, for we have dispelled the fears that grip us without justification. And as for pains, those that are groundless, we have completely excised, while those that are natural, we have reduced to an absolute minimum, making their magnitude minute. So he's phrasing for us the general goal of the discussion, how to live. And then it's going to be interesting for us to see what topics that he decides to talk about next. And to highlight there what we've just been discussing for the last few minutes, before he even goes into discussing the medicines that bring salvation, he wants to cover the issue of, well, does it make any sense even to try? Is it even possible to know anything? Is it possible to study nature and get any benefit out of it? If it's impossible to do that, we're just wasting our time. So he has to establish, just as Lucretius does and extensively in the discussion of images and illusions and knowledge, I think it's in book 4 of Lucretius, he's going early in the presentation back to this issue of whether knowledge is even possible. And he's telling you that some people are going to tell you that knowledge is impossible, that there's a flux out there, that everything's in motion. You can't even dip your toe into the same stream twice. Everything moves so fast that you can't get a grip on any kind of reality. And really, that's one of the basics of Epicurean philosophy, is that atomism allows us to understand how the motion of the universe can be understood through the senses, and educates us on how to use the senses intelligently to live successfully, even though there is this motion. Again, I'll go back to fragment number 5 again. And I've seen controversy that people say, well, this isn't the view of Aristotle in the Peripatetic, but he specifically says in fragment 5 that Aristotle and those who hold the same views as Aristotle say that nothing is scientifically knowable because of things are continually in the flux and its rapidity, and that they evade our apprehension. We, on the other hand, acknowledge their flux, but not it being so rapid that the nature of each thing is at no time apprehensible by sense perception. And he uses, after that, the very same illustration that Lucretius uses, because he says that those people who argue that nothing can be known, he says, indeed, in no way would the upholders of the Aristotelian view be able to say what they maintain, that at one time this is white and this is black, unless they at some point know the difference between white and black. In other words, if they had not previous knowledge of the nature of both white and black. So just like Lucretius says that those people who allege that knowledge is impossible are fools who are like standing on their head, Diogenes of Oinoanda makes the same observation. So early on in the presentation of the wall, you're starting off with the question of, is knowledge possible at all, before you even get to discussions of a lot of the details of how to live.
Cassius, let me say something here, because you've drawn a comparison, I should say, between Diogenes of Oinoanda and Lucretius, and there's certainly a strong point to be made, particularly on this focus on natural science. But Lucretius has developed this reputation partially for things he says about shipwrecks and standing on towers and all that, about being somewhat careless and even callous in the face of the suffering of mankind. And whether you think that's a fair interpretation or not, that is certainly a reputation that he has gotten for himself. One thing that sets Diogenes of Oinoanda apart, and one reason that I continually point people to Diogenes of Oinoanda, if they're more interested in the ethical side of Epicurean philosophy, is lines like this, where he says, "Moreover, it is right to help also generations to come, for they too belong to us, though they are still unborn. And besides, love of humanity prompts us to aid also the foreigners who come here, since they also are kindred to us in ways, being human." And so I guess I just wanted to say that this is a great text, partially for that reason, because some people will come to Epicurus and find him maybe too involved in the interest of the self, of pleasure and pain, and how do we avoid our own pain, and how do we pursue our own pleasure. Some people will go to Lucretius and find him maybe too callous in the face of other people's suffering. Diogenes of Oinoanda is clear that he takes the suffering of other people for his own in some ways. That's the whole reason he's writing this, is because he sees this pain, this suffering that exists in the people around him, and he wants to do something to help. And he's prompted particularly by love of humanity. And his love of humanity is not restricted merely to the world of the Greeks or to his townspeople or to his family, but it extends to all humans. There's something, I think, worth saying about that. And one of the reasons that this inscription is so worth reading is because he makes explicit what I think Lucretius maybe makes implicit. You know, Lucretius is writing this long form poem. It's clear to me though it's not clear to everyone that he has other people's interests at heart, or he wouldn't bother putting pen to paper. Why write 7,000 lines of difficult, dense Latin hexameter if you don't expect people are going to read it and profit from it? But that's, as I say, the reputation that Lucretius has gotten for himself. It's a reputation that you could not put on Diogenes of Oinoanda. This could not be laid at his doorstep. This idea that he's callous in the face of the suffering of humanity. He takes that as the cause for why he does what he does.
You use the word reputation, and that's the word I would jump on to expand on that, Joshua. That's so much of what we face in the discussion of Epicurean philosophy. It has a reputation that, in my view, I think the view of most of us who really get into it, that is totally misrepresentative and is a total misunderstanding of the philosophy as a whole. It's so easy to pick out one passage here and there, such as in Lucretius, the opening of Book 2. It's sweet to observe from the shore the distress of the ships at sea. And you take those statements like that, if you focus on it, and it's easy to caricature. I would argue that's what Cicero does in opposing Epicurean philosophy in his books and his works, is he's taking things out of context and making it look bad by taking it out of context. That's a standard lawyer trick of ways to discredit and try to suppress someone else's opinion that you disagree with. You take things out of context and make them look ridiculous. And you'll read that people will say that Lucretius, his physics even, were significantly different than Epicurus's and so forth. I don't think there's any reason to believe that any of the thrust of Epicurean philosophy has changed significantly from the time Epicurus wrote it. And so you're right, Joshua. You can clearly understand when reading Diogenes of Oinoanda that we are concerned about making people our friends. We're concerned about helping people that we can help. In this section, he talks about talking to people who are well constituted or well disposed towards us and so forth. So there's always this realism that not everybody is going to agree with us. But Epicurus is writing his letters to dispel confusion because he gets pleasure from it, because he avoids the pain of seeing people in distress around him. That's what Lucretius is doing. That's what Diogenes of Oinoanda is doing. And that's what the philosophy as a whole is doing. And the best way to understand that is to familiarize yourself with the whole body of the text like this and use your own common sense to put it all in perspective and realize that it all fits together. And that taking something out of context that appears to say something different is going to lead you down an erroneous path. And when somebody does that, and they do it all the time, it's up to the individual who's studying Epicurus to bring it back in his own mind in a consistent whole. And the more you read into it, the more you see the way these things are discussed by different people over hundreds of years within the Epicurean movement, you get to understand the big picture, and you're vaccinated, so to speak. You're made immune, given the strength to avoid falling for these misrepresentations of the philosophy. We don't have the ability, most of us, to erect a stone wall at the end of our lives to explain to other people what we think is the most important aspects of life. But to some extent, we all have the same need, and it makes sense for all of us to want to try to do the same thing, to distill in our minds an outline of the most important aspects of the philosophy, just like Epicurus says in the letter to Herodotus. That's what Lucretius has done. That's what Diogenes of Oinoanda has done. They've thought about what they've learned from the philosophy. They've brought together the most important aspects of it, and they've found a way to articulate the important points to other people who are not professional philosophers. This wall is the furthest thing a sermon to a group of professional philosophers at a school. It's to the public at large. If you can't explain Epicurean philosophy in a way that probably the average high school student can understand it, then you really haven't, in my view, come to a good understanding of it yourself to be able to articulate the important points. We're being pretty general today about the goal and the purpose of everything, but I think that's probably the best way to start out this. And that's what Diogenes of Oinoanda starts it out with himself. He's explaining the purpose of it from a very general background level before he dives into the details. So maybe the general topic to talk about in closing would be just what role does explaining Epicurean philosophy to other people have in somebody who wants to study Epicurus and get the most of it? Are you going to be able to get the most out of Epicurean philosophy by just reading books, by just reading Lucretius, by reading the letters of Epicurus and studying them yourself? Or do you have to somehow find a way to apply it and talk about it to other people?
That clearly, to me, is the best mode of studying this philosophy and applying it. And it's at the heart of what he's trying to do here, is to get as many people as possible involved in the philosophy, prompted by love of humanity and by the approach of getting the message out to as many people as possible. In what is really the largest, longest inscription to come down to us from the ancient world. There's no other school of philosophy who took this method of inscribing the philosophy on 260 odd feet of wall. This was a very Epicurean thing to do, although he was, I think, probably the only Epicurean to do it. But it expresses a deep desire to get the message out to other people.
That's what, to some extent, every significant Epicurean leader, maybe this is just being circular to say this, but every important Epicurean leader that we're aware of devoted significant amounts of time to writing or talking or promoting the philosophy to other people. It's not something that they just meditated on themselves in their own minds and stopped.
Yeah, it was the same instinct that led to putting Epicurus's bust in the middle of the agora or out in public spaces where it could be seen and where people could be drawn to it. And it's the same instinct, I hope, that drives us to do what we're doing here today. Calasini, I particularly want to get your opinion on this love of humanity issue, because I know we've had people come to the forum. We had a really good participant in one of our phone calls who found in Epicureanism a coldness or a self-interest that was contrary to his desire, which was to see more of a compassion, maybe, for other people. And I know that because, Calasini, you come, as I do, from a Buddhist background, if this letter or this inscription is helpful in any way to understanding a different dimension of the philosophy, or the same dimension of the philosophy as we see elsewhere, but more directly.
Well, I noticed that this wording here about the concern for humanity, that does shed a different light on things in a way, as it does take the attention away from the self and it extends it outward. And in that action, there is happiness that can be gained in considering those surrounding you and considering their well-being. As you do so, that also increases your own well-being.
I tend to agree, and I think that Diogenes Oinoanda found that this was helpful probably for himself. He says that he would do all in his power to address people individually if he could, and that gives some idea maybe to the missionary zeal of the early Epicureans. I know that's not a characterization that everyone's going to be happy with, but certainly there is this idea that if you can help people by maybe teaching them how to help themselves, is good for you too. That's something I get out of this inscription. And that's why I direct people to it when it comes up in conversation.
Joshua, I've run into this issue as well. And it's also in Cicero, the Torquatus section, where Torquatus brings up the point that some people argue that if you're an Epicurean, you can't have any friends because you're somehow so devoted to your own pleasure that you're going to only be so selfish that there's no basis for friendship. And Torquatus answers that at some length in that material, but the Epicurean response is that the opposite is true, that in fact, without the Epicurean understanding of the universe and how pleasure motivates everybody, there's really no basis for friendship at all, because there's really there's no God telling you to have friends. There's no ideal form out there that says you should have friends or treat people nicely. I mean, this is one of the issues that comes up in the discussion of humanism sometimes. What is the real basis for wanting to act humanely towards other people? Life really boils down to these questions of, are you doing it because God told you to? Are you doing it because you just think there's some abstract good that requires you to do it? That comes down to problems with some of the humanist theory. But what Torquatus is saying is that, indeed, if you're concerned about living a happy life, the most important thing practically that you can do is to be surrounded by people who like you, who you enjoy being with, and who are going to help you in times of distress, while you at the same time help them in times of distress. That's one of the Vatican sayings, that it's not the actual help of our friends that we need. It's most important. It's the understanding that if we do need help, we'll have some people available to be of assistance to us. So it's not just an abstraction in the sense of love humanity, for some unknown reason or for some mystical reason. It's the reality of the universe that the person is going to live happily who is around people who he likes and he takes care of and who take care of him and who like him. So I think from the Epicurean point of view, there should never be any confusion about this at all. This is the best and really only sound basis for friendship and love of humanity in the first place. Again, not because you're doing it because God told you to, but because that's the way humans are made up, that we live most successfully and most happily when we are kind and compassionate and concerned and humane to each other. Again, the point being, there's no contradiction from an Epicurean point of view. The allegation that Epicureans are inhumane or utterly selfish is ridiculous. I think this is the distinction between the Ayn Rand objectivist point of view. When you put self-interest above everything else, which is what the Randians do, that leads to the problem that Cicero is rightly concerned about. Because if you're only concerned about yourself and you just narrowly look at it moment to moment like that, then you're not going to see the big picture, which is that truly your self-interest, truly your pleasure in life comes from being good to other people so that you have a good time with them and everybody enjoys that community of friendship. So it's a hugely important point. We do see most clearly in Diogenes of Oinoanda, even though I think it firmly and clearly exists in the other Epicurean writers as well. Okay, before we close, anybody want to introduce anything new?
No, but maybe I can now put Martin on the spot by saying, by accusing natural science of being unable to be of any benefit to us, because that's what he's writing against, is this idea that natural science is just a worthless branch of study. I think, Martin, for a number of reasons, philosophical as well as personal, you would push back against that. That's my suspicion.
Yeah, at least I push back on an individual level. So the biggest advantage in Epicurean philosophy is, of course, understanding. So originally, as it was sorted out by Epicurus, by its nature, it was metaphysics, but it was actually mentioned as physics. That means the speculations of what we don't know was kept to a minimum, and everything was in some way won through thinking about observations. And in this way, he built a whole philosophy on science, on natural science in that sense. So that means for Epicurean philosophy, it has a lot of benefit because we give an understanding which helps us not to fear the gods and not to fear death.
Yeah, that's a good way to summarize it. And that is one of the other main points that I think Diogenes of Oinoanda is trying to articulate here, and we'll probably get more of as we go through the rest of the inscription.
So what we're seeing here is Epicurus was writing in around, say, 300 BC, and this is maybe 150 AD. So some 400 years have passed, and basically the same message that Epicurus started so much earlier is being repeated and endorsed so much later in very similar terms. So you're seeing here the continuity of the message, because Diogenes of Oinoanda, hundreds of years later, has taken the position that it has been successful in his life and led to a much better result for him to employ this philosophy. So let's go ahead and talk about closing thoughts for today. And Martin, I know you've just spoken, but do you have anything else for today?
No, I have nothing to add.
Calasini, any closing thoughts for today?
Yes, I just wanted to bring up something that caught my eye when I was reading toward the end of fragment number 1. And it talks about, it says, pains that are groundless, we have completely excised. Pains that are natural, we have reduced to an absolute minimum. But the phrasing here that caught my eye is it says pains that are groundless. And I seem to remember that in the principal doctrines, it always says desires. It doesn't say pains. So this is kind of a slightly different take on that.
That's a good observation.
Mental pain is maybe groundless.
Certainly, if you're experiencing pain because you don't live in a golden palace and surrounded by riches and luxury, if you feel that as a kind of pain, that to me would be a groundless kind of pain. I don't want to articulate again the idea that all desire is pain, but if some desire presents as pain, particularly vain ambition is a kind of pain, then that would be groundless. That would be a kind of mental pain, as Martin has said.
I'd be curious, if we compare the words from the principal doctrine versus the word in this location in the wall, are they the same word or are they different words? That's what I really would want to know.
Sounds to me like we've got some homework for Don here.
And our friend Godfrey on the forum as well. This is a great example of how the study never gets finished, because that's a really good observation, Calasini, that the phrasing is different here. We've just had a long discussion on the forum about desires and the natural and necessary issues and so forth. I don't believe we referred to this text when we were discussing that. So we're going to want to take this particular text and try to compare and contrast and incorporate this into the general discussion, because it was a pretty fruitful direction, I think, for us to be discussing the issues of desires and emptiness and groundlessness and so forth in terms of desires. If this wording here is in fact accurate, and if it does appear to diverge from the wording in the doctrines, then we're going to want to talk about that and look and see why that might be. And of course, the natural and necessary issue is what they generally go back and forth about. So this does seem to be phrased in a little bit different way that's going to be useful for us to examine. Calasini, anything else for today?
No, that's it. It's been very interesting to hear the history of this and the location and all of that. So I've really enjoyed that and looking forward to diving onward.
Okay, Joshua.
I am very happy to be getting into this inscription. I think it's so interesting in a number of different ways, not least because it's so weird, isn't it, to buy a piazza or portico or whatever and inscribe this huge, long series of texts onto the rock is a very odd thing to do. And I wonder how people took it in that age.
Yes, it's weird and unusual, and I think that is the real attractiveness in our discussing it and using it as a springboard for what indeed we think we should do ourselves. And not to get back into that whole theme again, but it appears that Lucretius and now Diogenes of Oinoanda, they conclude from having access to the Epicurean text and really immersing themselves in it, that it's an important thing for them to do to distill it down into a summary and to decide what's the most important thing to say to somebody if you're nearing the end of your life or you're not going to have an opportunity to talk with them again. What are the most important things for those people to know? So from that point of view, I think it's really interesting and challenging for us to take the time to think about how we ourselves would summarize the important points and what we think is the most important thing to talk about as we study Epicurean philosophy and try to make good use of it.
One last thing, because obviously putting together inscriptions was a very common thing to do for people with authority, kings, emperors, I think the Rosetta Stone was maybe a proclamation of some kind of king. But for just a person to do this, to put their philosophy out there, is very weird and alien and strange. But the fact that it comes down to us is so good because it gives us a unique take from a unique place in a unique period of time of Epicurean philosophy. And so to have this is a great resource.
Okay, very good. Well, hopefully today we've set the stage for several more episodes discussing some of the details of what Diogenes of Oinoanda thought was important. So we'll come back next week and continue on with the discussion. Thanks, everybody, for being with us today. Drop by the forum if you can, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Goodbye.